All right, thanks everyone for joining us for the fourth webinar in the Improve Your Home Energy Efficiency, the Retrofit Journey. My name is Jenna. I'm a Built Environment Initiatives Coordinator with the Community Energy Association, and I'll be facilitating tonight's webinar. So today's session will be presented in two parts. First, we'll hear from Ben with Riverside Energy Systems, who will be speaking to ways that you can reduce your electricity use in your home and manage your upgrades without needing a panel upgrade. After Ben's presentation, we'll break for a few questions from you folks before passing things over to Robyn Webb and Gary Hamer with BC Hydro and George Thompson with FortisBC. They're going to speak to the utilities plan for grid management to ensure BC residents can install heat pumps and EV charging equipment with confidence. And then after both presentations from utilities, we'll do a joint question and answer period. So yeah, as we go through, feel free to pop your questions in the chat. I'll be keeping track of all of them and we'll bring them through to the speakers after their presentations. All right, the next slide there, please. Perfect. So I'm joining from what is now known as Nelson, but for thousands of years has been the traditional homeland of the Sinixt Nation, the Silks Nation, and the Ktunaxa Nation, and is home to the Métis and many diverse Indigenous people. So I'd just like to express my sincere and deep respect and gratitude for their generations of stewardship over the waters, mountains, and forests of this area and across Canada. So as part of CEA's commitment to truth and reconciliation, we recognize the importance of amplifying Indigenous climate leadership. So I wanted to start off today's session by highlighting the completion of a Passive House sixplex by Yale Nation. So Yale First Nation is a small First Nation community. Their territory begins in the Fraser Valley and runs along the Fraser River to the beginning of the Fraser Canyon. So their territory is around what is now known as Hope in BC. And Yale First Nation was looking for an innovative solution to providing adequate housing for members of their community that would go beyond meeting minimum building code requirements. So they contracted Britco Construction to support with the design, manufacturing, and installation of a modular passive house complex that could withstand the wet climate conditions of the area, reduce energy costs for residents, and offer a more environmentally responsible housing alternative. So the multi-unit passive house project consists of 6 two-story attached townhomes, and the 12 modules were manufactured at Britco Construction's facility in Agassiz while site foundation work was being completed, which significantly reduced the overall project deadline. And then once finished, the modules were transported to the site in Ruby Creek and Hope and installed in 5 days. So the construction team then proceeded with completing the final connections, exterior finishing, and passive house testing to achieve a successful completion of a modular passive house project for the Yale First Nation in Hope, BC. So for more information, you can, I don't have the link there, but I will provide the link in the follow-up email and you can go read some more details for yourself. All right, so for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I'd just like to introduce who we are. So the Community Energy Association, or CEA, we're a registered charity and nonprofit. We're dedicated to driving ambitious climate and energy initiatives by local government and Indigenous communities. So we're the only nonprofit in BC focused solely on empowering local government and Indigenous communities to take meaningful action on climate and energy. So our work acknowledges that the built environment is a major source of community greenhouse gas emissions. And by focusing on this sector, we can achieve significant reductions in emissions, enhance community resilience and energy security, and improve the comfort, health, and safety of our homes. Forward slide there, I'll just introduce one of our many projects dedicated to building capacity around high performance buildings. So the Kootenay Clean Energy Transition was created to support the evolving landscape of energy efficiency, renewable energy, and home comfort. So with KSET, we aim to help Kootenay and boundary communities prepare for a more energy efficient and healthy future. And we offer training and capacity building sessions for building professionals, as well as community workshops on high performance building like this one here. So thanks to the generous support of the organizations listed at the bottom of the slide, we're able to provide these workshops for free in collaboration with industry experts. All right, so I'm going to pass things over to our first presenter here, Ben. But just as I mentioned, if you have questions as we go through, feel free to pop them in the chat. I'll keep record of them, and then we'll ask the speakers during the appropriate kind of question and answer period. You will have noticed too, we are recording tonight's session, and we'll be sharing a link to that recording with you folks, along with the presentation slides early next week. And that is it from me, Ben. I'll pass things over to you.
Hey, thanks, Jenna. So I'm Ben Giudici. I'm with Riverside Energy Systems out of Kamloops, BC. And we do a lot of work with solar PV and energy storage systems, and we're quite heavily involved in energy retrofits. And in recent years, we've been asked to support builders and other groups with the impacts around electrical service demand during electrification. So tonight, I wanted to talk about some of the fundamental concepts around load management strategies, how we can mitigate electrical demand and even reduce consumption, as Jenna was just mentioning. So what I'm hoping to do tonight is to talk about why electrical impacts matter when we're doing energy retrofit planning, what the challenges are around energy retrofit electrifications when it comes to sizing services, how it is that we can potentially use technologies and strategies to modify a home's electrical personality so it's less high maintenance or less demanding, if you will. And I wanted to sort of underpin the whole discussion by using a retrofit case study for a Kamloops home, which I happen to know quite a bit about because it's my house, and so that'll be good. I wanted to say a couple of words about solar PV and storage and potentially their role in the energy retrofitting arena, and then lastly, call to action, like how we can achieve best results. So why do electrical impacts matter when we're doing a retrofit? Well, typically when we electrify HVAC in particular, it can dramatically affect the demand, electrical demand, which can have a big impact on service requirements, which can increase the costs very significantly. And so projects that require electrical service upgrades are less likely to proceed. So conversely, if we can reduce the need for those upgrades, they're more likely to go ahead, and we're more likely to achieve our retrofitting goals at large. So it used to be that it was sort of too bad, so sad, this cost would get passed on to consumers. But as we're doing more and more electrification and resulting energy retrofits, this problem is impacting utilities as well. And as we'll see in a moment, it's actually impacting government mandates. So it's having a broader impact than it used to. So when we do electrical retrofits involving electrification of HVAC, we will typically also see envelope improvements that require things like HRVs or ERVs to help ventilate. We'll switch to electric hot water heating. We'll typically retrofit natural gas heating for air source heat pumps. Often we'll see people preparing for EVs and the like, and all of this means higher continuous demand, which often will trigger people saying, "Oh, well, we're going to have to upgrade services to get us there," based on Section 8 of the Canadian Electrical Code. And then, of course, all of these things also increase our electrical consumption and our dependence on the grid. So this is where people will often look at ways to be more grid resilient in their retrofits. So getting back to why electrical service upgrades cost so much, when it's an overhead service, the utility will power the building using overhead conductors, which are relatively easy to change out. Whereas if it's underground, like the one on the left, and conductors will be potentially under the ground, under driveways, under sidewalks, and it's much more expensive to accommodate a service upgrade where we have to upsize conductors. Now, I want to be really clear. I'm not talking about upgrading the electrical panel to make it bigger. I'm talking about upgrading the service so that it can potentially draw more demand, more power from the grid when it's required. So let's not confuse upsizing a panel to make it bigger to create more breaker positions with upsizing the service. They're two very different things. I'm talking about upsizing the service. Okay, so when we look at service sizing, the Canadian Electrical Code Section 8 covers that off. And as many of you will know, the Canadian Electrical Code is based on an abundance of caution, and it's very safety centric around avoiding service overloads under worst case scenarios. So what that means is that sizing is founded on three principles in the Canadian Electrical Code. The first thing is that there's a mandatory derating of the main electrical service breaker. We're not allowed to allow it to carry more than 80% of its rating. And this is to avoid nuisance tripping. So that's one concept. The second one is that we have an idea called base loading, something that describes the load never being less than this base loading. And that's dictated strictly by the living area of the building, not by actual loads. So that ends up being quite punitive, as we'll see in a moment. And then the third concept is that any heavy loads in excess of 1500 watts are assumed to all run at the same time. In other words, we assume load concurrence. So as I mentioned, this leads to a worst case scenario. Now, there's also permissible load control methods in Section 8 that can help us lessen service upgrading requirements if we apply them carefully. And sometimes those are overlooked. So we're going to look at those a bit here in a couple of minutes. So it turns out that utilities size their infrastructure using engineering standards. They look at what is the likely maximum load. They don't look at what the worst possible scenario is. They assume that loads are diverse and they will not all run concurrently. In other words, they're assuming load diversity. So we have these two paradigms, CEC, safety, which assumes load concurrence, and utility practical engineering standards, which assume load diversity. And those two butt heads. In fact, if a utility was forced to size their transformers to meet 100% load concurrence, this 50 kilowatt pad mount transformer that serves 8 to 10 100 amp residential services would have to be 4 or 5 times the size. So, and we know they're not, and the reason they're not is because they don't need to be. This is inherently the trouble, because behind the meter, we're forced to comply with Canadian Electrical Code. In front of the meter, engineering standards and utility standards apply, which are not the same as CEC. So first up, we have to derate our main breaker, main fuse. So this means that our 100 amp service really can't deliver more than 80 amps if it's going to be compliant. And same, a 200 can only deliver 160. This is Rule 8-104, Part 6. That constraint, on top of continuous base loads, or basic load, as it's also called, this is founded on strictly the living area of the building. So in the case of this Kamloops case study house that we're looking at, there's 184 square meters of effective living area. And based on that, we have to apply these stringent rules of thumb, and we wind up with literally a 7,000 watt assumption and of basic load, which means that we've already taken up 37% of our 100 amp service, and we've only got 50.8 amps to work with. So that's a pretty big bite. Just, applying a rule of thumb. So the next thing is continuous load. So we take things like electric space heating and cooling, domestic electric hot water tanks, electric ranges, dryers, EV charging, hot tubs, etc. And some of these devices, like an electric range, can be derated to some extent. But fundamentally, we're more or less assuming that these are all running concurrently. So it adds up very quickly. And if we take the case study Kamloops house, which just happens to be my house, which has natural gas furnace, natural gas hot water, an electric range, an electric dryer, and a 2.5 ton air conditioner. It turns out when I apply these rules that I'm just under what I'm allowed. So my service is currently compliant. So now if I was to contemplate an energy retrofit, and the example I picked was adding an air source heat pump, we can see that potentially I'm going to run into trouble. So let's look at what I can maybe do to change the home's electrical personality. So the first thing we can do is we can carefully select equipment. So some of the other speakers, in particular Gary Hamer, is going to tell us, and very rightly so, that not all air source heat pumps are created equally. So, a garden variety heat pump will have its efficiency droop, like this, so that beyond about -10, its mechanical advantage coefficient of performance will have dramatically dropped, and it's not going to be much good, and we'll be needing supplementary heat to help us out. If, on the other hand, we spent some extra money and we chose a cold climate heat pump, which are getting better and better, some of them can operate down to -20 and lower and still have a pretty decent coefficient of performance before they need electric boost. So this means that in some climates, like say Vancouver Island or the Lower Mainland, you could potentially not need electric boost at all, which will dramatically lower the service demand. So that's one thing we can do. And then in Section 8, as I mentioned, there are some other rules which are not paid as close attention to all the time, although they're gaining more traction lately, where, for instance, if we're using an EV charger in the building, if we use a service demand controlled switching device that does not allow the charger to work unless there's sufficient margin left in the service, we don't even have to include it in our service calculation. So that's a really great feature to harness. Secondly, there's this principle that is referred to as interlocking, which is basically making it impossible for more than one load to run at a time and put loads on a common circuit. So for example, if we can put a couple of loads on the same circuit and interlock them using a device such that only one can run at a time, then Rule 8106, 2 and 3 tell us that we only have to consider the largest of the two. So this is another benefit. And then lastly, and this is the one that's emerging a lot recently, is something called demonstrated load, where we actually justify our service calculations in our retrofit based on historical load measurements, actual real data, as opposed to the rules of thumb that we see in traditional code service sizing guidelines. So how do these devices work? Well, here's an example of a device that will allow us to eliminate the EV charger from the service sizing calculation. This is a smart load switch which uses current transformers to measure the service demand current and either enable or disable the EV charger based on whether the service has enough capacity left in it at that moment in time. Using this strategy, the EV charger can be scratched off and we don't even have to count it in our service sizing. Other strategies with interlocking, Rule 8, 106, 2 and 3, we can install smart splitters. This is an example of a plug-in one, but you can also get hardwired ones. And these smart splitters mediate the use of the circuit between two loads. So in this case, the dryer has primary priority and the EV charger has standby priority, so that the EV charger could only operate if the dryer is not operating. So this is the kind of logical switching we can use to again, control our demand. What is emerging as another promising technology, and it's being used extensively in Europe and Asia and even parts of the US now, is using smart panels that not only can measure the total demand on the service, but also can measure the demand from individual loads like an electric range, a clothes dryer, EV charger, air source heat pump, etc. And through priority programming, selectively shed loads in real time to make sure that we never exceed the service demand. This technology is tried and proven, and it's emerging and gaining traction all over the world. In Canada, it's still not widely endorsed by safety authorities, but I'm quite certain that nut is going to crack in the next few years. And I hope it does anyway, because it's a very sophisticated and easily adopted strategy to solve this problem of mitigating service sizing when we're retrofitting larger electrical loads.
Can I just help out here? We're now preparing a standard that will evaluate whether, well, how well these panels work. And so manufacturers are claiming things. We need to test and rate them. And some will be really smart and some will be kind of dumb, and there'll be everything in between. So I'm looking forward to working with you on that as well.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And it's really exciting to see that utilities are becoming very interested in these things. They used to be just sort of technological toys for early adopters, but they are now becoming mainstream. And I know Gary himself has a Leviton smart panel technology installed in his home, and I know he's finding the available metrics and diagnostics very useful.
I hope that you'll talk about PV and storage too, Ben. Because this is an integral component within that and allows for self-sufficiency, load management, and so on. So I'll let you get back to your presentation, but yes.
Yeah, I will say a little bit about solar and storage at the end, Gary. Thanks for that. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So one of the most exciting bits of leverage we have available is the demonstrated load clause, which is Rule 8.106.9, where we are allowed by code to use historical load measurements to justify what our remaining capacity is, rather than using these worst case rules of thumb by adding up basic load and continuous load and assuming everything is concurrent. Those historical load measurements can be completed by a qualified professional. Typically, this would be an electrical contractor, an FSR, also known as master electrician, or an electrical engineer. And to do this, we would use one of either 12-month or more hourly kilowatt-hour utility data, which is available directly for download from BC Hydro. And I believe even Fortis also has this available. It may require a special request, but I understand Fortis can provide this data as well. Or alternately, if you live in a jurisdiction where this is not available, then you can connect a third-party revenue grade power energy data logger and do these measurements yourself in the year preceding your energy retrofit and get that data and justify your sizing that way. So what I've shown here is a couple of slides of how this works. If you're a BC Hydro customer, you log into your My Hydro account, you navigate to consumption graphs, and you click on export data. And then what will happen is you'll be asked to give a range, and you'll give a full year's worth of data. And ask for hourly intervals. It has to be hourly intervals. And when you export it, it'll download as a CSV file, which you can import directly into a spreadsheet. So I did that for the Kamloops case study house, which has a 100 amp electrical service equipped, as I mentioned earlier. And what I discovered was that the highest my demand was ever in the entire 24-month period I studied. Actually, this was just 1 year. It was, 2 years. And it was never higher than 26.7 amps. So certainly never exceeded 30. And when I look at the basic load, effectively, what is the lowest my load ever gets? Never gets lower. Well, it's way down at 2 or 3 amps. you know, versus the 29 amps that I was forced to assume using the CEC living area method. So not only was my demonstrated peak load around or less than 50% of the classic CSE simultaneous concurrence load assumption, but my basic load was also way less than the 7 kilowatts that I was forced to assume by the 7,000 watts, I mean. So this is super powerful because this is real. This is real data. That's why we call it demonstrated. So if I go back to this case study house of mine, if I'd wanted to add the a heat pump, a 2.5 ton heat pump with a 5 kilowatt supplementary electric boost heater, using the traditional CEC methods, I'd be way over the 80 amps I'm allowed, and I would have had to do a service upgrade. Sometimes we're finding that in retrofits, often this is where things stop and no one digs any deeper. But if we dig a little deeper and we apply the Technical Safety BC bulletin that shows how to use the demonstrated load information in BC, Technical Safety BC says if we take our maximum demand load, which in my case was 26.7 amps, and we multiply it by 127%, we'll get a maximum demand load projection that we can use as a demonstrated load to get our augmented load, it's called. So doing so, using that trick with using the historical data and my maximum demand uprated to 33.4 amps by multiplying by 125%, I can put in that heat pump with the boost heat and have plenty of margin left, and there's a happy ending, no service upgrade required. And in fact, if I could even, you know, add an electric hot water tank and an EV charger. If I interlocked the domestic hot water tank with the supplementary electric heater, we'd be fine. I'd only have to count the electric boost heat, which is the bigger of the two. And I could add an EV charger if I used as a smart load switch and didn't even need to count it here. So this is an example, a real example, where a retrofit could be done using demonstrated load and interlocking and a smart load switch to control the EV charger and not require a service upgrade from the 100 amp service. Now, it won't always turn out this way, but I know, for instance, that BC Hydro has studied a number of customers that had installed EV chargers and had done service upgrades and looked back at the loading using this technique and discovered that a big majority were not necessary. Can you speak to that, Gary, quickly?
Yeah, it's as you pointed out earlier, it's always an inconvenience if you're going to be doing a service size upgrade, and costly. And so if there's a way that you can avoid doing that, like putting in a smart panel that maybe it's as expensive as a service upgrade, or maybe it's half of it, but the point is that it gives you much greater flexibility with your new system than it would if you stayed with an old system but larger. Well, doing a service upgrade is going to be trigger a panel upgrade regardless. Then is the opportunity to put in a smart panel. But if you can, by all means, avoid doing a service upgrade. Makes everyone's life simpler and costs less money, frankly.
Yeah, I was actually referring to that study you'd mentioned some time back where people had done service upgrades when they installed EV chargers, and in many cases it turned out it wasn't necessary.
That's true.
Yeah, I thought Hydro had done some work on that.
That was with an EV charging program, and after they had had the charger installed, we looked at it and realized that the vast majority of them, and 80 to 90%, that's a big number, did not need to do a service upgrade. So yeah, start there.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So lastly, just a couple of words about solar PV and storage, we find very often in energy retrofits that because consumption is going to increase, electrical consumption will rise, people are interested in mitigating that. A simple grid-connected system under a net metering program or a self-generation program will let us do that. It'll interact with the grid to reduce how much we have to buy from the grid, and outflow to the grid when it's producing surplus. And under a net metering scenario, that energy can be stored and used later. The downside of this kind of a system is that the PV system will shut down when you have a grid outage. So I'll just mention that my home, actually the case study home, already has a 6 kilowatt PV system. It's making us electrically net zero now, but I've estimated that if we did a heat pump retrofit, that this system would still cause us to have the advantage of about a 35 to a 45% grid consumption reduction by the fact that we have solar. So the energy consumption reduction can happen that way. Alternately, if we also add storage, then it's a little bit more sophisticated, because not only can it interact with the grid to reduce our consumption and actually leverage time of use rates, which I'll talk about in a minute, but it can also provide backup of essential loads. So for instance, if the grid were to go down, all of this equipment would power down, but the BESS and solar would continue to back up the essential loads. And people are becoming more and more interested in this, given wildfires and atmospheric rivers and other climate events that have caused long outages over the last couple of years. One of the interesting benefits of this approach is that because of the grid interaction, the BESS system is also able to, on demand, increase its output and reduce how much we might be consuming during high time of use rates. And in fact, it's even able to export surplus energy to the grid, and with some additional smarts, actually reduce the demand of the service, the peak demand on the service. This is what Gary was talking about. So an idea around how that would work is if you were on a time of use rate, which BC Hydro has an optional one now, during the day, you might preferentially charge the battery system with your solar and not export to the grid until the battery's full. During the on-peak window, where your energy would be more expensive, you would heavily discharge the BESS to reduce your on-peak use and reduce your peak demand. And then later in the day, if it was winter and solar isn't working so great, you might choose to recharge your BESS from the grid when the rates are a bit lower. So this kind of a infrastructure will allow us not just to provide backup for essential loads, interact with the grid to reduce our consumption. It'll also allow us to reduce our demand and particularly reduce consumption during peak hours. So this is sort of the full meal deal. So coupled with load control strategies, you get the best of all the worlds. So how do we do this well? Well, let's be mindful that electrification does impact service sizing, and realize that those are expensive and maybe even unavailable in some utility jurisdictions. Let's realize that classic service sizing assumptions could trigger calls for service upsizing that might not be warranted if we dig a little deeper. And that Section 8 of the code also provides mitigation methods that we can use to reduce our service impacts, like load switches, smart load switches, splitters, and in particular, this really great demonstrated load strategy, which I think is going to have some impact. And then lastly, often with electrification, we'll find that owners are motivated for solar and storage to reduce their consumption and to reduce their peak demand and potentially reduce time of use consumption during the peak demand window. Solar and storage impact the electrical design of the building. And so my recommendation is that we must holistically consider not just electrical service sizing, but also integration of solar and PV at the design stage with a retrofit if you want to get good results. Okay, so that's all I have to say. Thank you for listening. And I'm willing to entertain some questions if we have time, Jenna.
Wonderful. Thanks, Ben. Yeah, we do still have a few minutes here. Thanks for that. I know that that was a lot of information to get into a short period of time. So I appreciate all of that. We had a couple questions come through in the chat, folks. We do have some time for a couple more. If you have questions, go ahead and pop them in. I know there was parts of your presentation that alluded to this, but maybe just some clarification. Chris asked, will upsizing the service make any changes to the 100 amp or 125 amp main panel?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, Jenna?
Will upsizing the service, so getting a service upgrade, require changes to the panel?
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. So let me go back to a slide here. Yeah, so let's suppose we look at this example here. So there's a 100 amp service on the right. So these 100 amp service conductors are the limit. So if we upsize our service to so that we have 200 amp service conductors, then we also have to upsize the panel to take advantage of that. So the new panel would have 200 amp or higher buses, and it would have a 200 amp main breaker. So yeah, if we're upsizing the service, it will almost always mean the panel as well, unless somebody installed an oversized panel to begin with, and had a smaller main breaker to accommodate. Yeah, good question.
Great, thank you. And then there were just a couple of questions around, I think there's some folks joining us from the States, so welcome. There were just some questions around smart panel adoption in the US. So you had mentioned that it was becoming adopted there. Is it currently available for purchase in the US?
Yeah, this technology is available for purchase all over North America. So in the US, there's a number of products that we can't get in Canada. Like one is a product from a company called Span. Okay, and then there's also Leviton. But most other vendors, like I know Eaton is making a smart panel as well. And then there's also a company called Savant, which was traditionally home automation, but they're now making smart demand controls as well. These are all available in the US. Span is not available in Canada, but the other ones are.
We're trying to change that, Ben.
Are we?
We are.
Oh, okay. I love guys with leverage, Gary. That's awesome.
I'll just say that the National Electrical Code in the United States is a bit more flexible on the ability to use these smart panels than the Canadian Electric Code, or at least that's what I've been told. And so Span is spending their time because they can use this to prove that they can keep below certain limits. And by doing so, they can, as Ben was saying, change their peaks during the peak period for the utility and help us out, or go off entirely if they have sufficient battery storage. So those types of things are available with smart panels, or will be, once we get the authorities having jurisdictions, the safety authorities, et cetera, in agreement that these things actually work. And so this is it's emerging technology, I'll say, not highly in application, but certainly the way of the future.
Great, thank you. And folks, I know I just saw a couple more questions pop in the chat, but it is time that we pass things over to BC Hydro. So thanks very much, Ben. Appreciate your time, appreciate that information. And it's my pleasure to introduce Robyn Webb and Gary Hamer. You've heard a bit from Gary, but I'll pass things along to them.
Took some of Ben's time, so Ben, you can chime in if
There
I'm
you go.
not saying enough or too much, or right.
I'm not keeping score, Gary.
And I was going to say, I think we might be able to speak to some of the questions that actually came up in the chat as well too. Yeah, thank you so much, CEA, for giving us some time to chat. And Ben, that was a fantastic presentation. This is something that comes up in mine and Gary's work on a daily basis. So thank you for that really clear and concise overview. CEA invited both BC Hydro and FortisBC here today, just to answer some of the other half of the questions that tend to come up when we're talking about building electrification and moving towards the adoption of heat pumps and EVs, which is not just at your household scale, but what needs to happen to the electrical system as a whole to prepare for both building and transportation electrification. So I'm going to give sort of a high level or macro overview of some of the things that BC Hydro is doing to prepare our system for building electrification. And then I'm going to pass it off to Gary, and he's going to talk a little bit more about some of the customer-facing programs, incentives, initiatives that we have underway that also help not just our customers adopt these electric technologies, but also help prepare the grid for reducing some of those peaks that we experience as a utility and our need to keep on building out new resources to meet them. So just to give you a bit of an overview, as a utility, we create something called an integrated resource plan, usually about every 5 years. And this plan is, it lays out our roadmap for how we are going to look at what that anticipated demand is in the future and how we're going to meet it as a utility. When we're creating an integrated resource plan, we always do it with scenarios, ensuring that it's flexible. So you can see from this graph here, we have a couple of different trajectories that we're planning for, where one of them would be this accelerated electrification scenario where, you know, BC is very enthusiastic about heat pumps and EVs, and we see lots of industrial electrification, all the way to something like the low load scenario, which would account for us going into a recession or something like this. So every time we create one of these plans, we're ensuring that we're looking at all of these different scenarios and how we would actually meet them. What we are seeing today, if you look back to 2003 here to 2023, you can see that demand has been quite flat for the last little while. And we know that that is not going to be the case as we are entering into this era of more electrification. So we're seeing a lot of population growth in BC. We're seeing the result of government climate policy from local governments, from the province. We're seeing lots of industrial electrification. And so with all of this put together, we are anticipating that there'll be about a 15% increase in the amount of electricity that's going to be consumed in BC by about 2030. So in light of that, you know, what are some of the things that we're doing to meet that growing demand? The first one is something that's probably on most people's radar. We are going to be bringing Site C, which will be our 31st hydroelectric dam in the system, online. Reservoir filling is actually currently happening, and some of the generating units at Site C are actually starting to generate electricity today. It was hard to even get updated speaking notes for this because it seems like it changes on a daily basis. But the goal here is to have all of the generating units with Site C up and running by the end of this year. And so just to give you some context, when Site C is up and running, it'll add to about 8% of our current supply. That would be enough to power about 500,000 homes or 1.7 million EVs in a year. The The next thing we're doing is we issued a call for power earlier this year, and the call for power actually closed in September. So this was an open call for new sources of renewable electricity. So we didn't state what those sources of electricity needed to be, but rather we're open to receiving bids as long as they were renewable. So this is the first call that we've issued as a utility in about 15 years, and it's a pretty important initiative for us as a utility in a number of ways. One of the criteria for projects that we're going to bid into this call for power is that each of the applicants had to partner with a local Indigenous community where the application for that particular project was coming from, and that Indigenous community would have to have a 25% equity co-ownership agreement for this project, meaning that the Indigenous communities would, get 25% of the revenue from the project over time. So, like I mentioned, this call actually closed in September. We were looking for about 3,000 gigawatt hours of new electricity, and we actually got applications for about 3 times that, so over 9,000 gigawatt hours. So we are currently in the process of reviewing those applications and hope to sign purchase agreements with the successful applicants before the end of 2025. Just to give you a bit of a sense of what actually came in with those applications, about 70% of them were wind, 20% were large scale, like utility scale solar PV projects, and the remaining were sort of a mix of small scale hydro, biomass, things like that. So as we're evaluating these projects, again, we're looking for that really large utility scale that can easily connect into our integrated system, and we're looking to keep costs down. So that'll be one of the big considerations for us too, is the price at which all of these projects were bid into the call for power. So you will certainly hear more about this by the end of the year. And our goal for these call for power projects is that they'll actually start to come online in fall 2028. So you can see quite a notable difference in the amount of time that it's going to take to build and bring solar and wind projects online from that of what it's taken to bring large-scale hydroelectric projects like Site C to generation. But I guess taking a step back from that too, I think it's not well known to many people that the cheapest source of new capacity for us as a utility isn't actually building new electrical generation, but it's actually investing in energy efficiency. So we've been investing in our energy efficiency or Power Smart programs for well over 20 years. And we have seen significant savings as a result of that, actually equivalent to just about 2 Site C's worth of generation through being able to provide our customers with incentives for them to actually reduce their energy usage over time. So moving forward, we're actually going to be investing even more in energy efficiency than we have in the past. And again, Gary's going to kind of dig into what some of those projects and programs will look like. And they're a little bit different from what you've seen in the past. They're not sort of the traditional energy efficiency programs that invest in things like attic insulation, for instance. A lot of them are really technology based. So we'll leave that to Gary to talk a little bit more about that. So I've talked a lot on the supply side. This slide here is a little bit more about the investments that we're making to actually bring the power from where it's generated into your communities. So earlier this year, Hydro announced $36 billion in capital investments. This is predominantly in our distribution infrastructure. So the infrastructure like substations and feeders that are actually located within the communities that you live in just to give you a sense of the magnitude, this is about 50% more investment than in our previous 10-year capital plan. So we're really gearing up to invest more in projects throughout the province. And so about 21 billion of that investment is in sustaining some of our existing infrastructure, expanding capacity of dams and substations. But then the remaining 15 billion really is on supporting this electrification and GHG reduction initiatives. So we're going to be hard at work getting these projects deployed around BC, and knowing that it's going to mean significant amount of economic growth and jobs associated with this too. So hopefully that'll be a positive benefit to these projects in a lot of communities across BC as well. All right, I'm going to pass it off to Gary. Gary, I want to note that this slide has a lot of animation, so I think I'm just going to bring it all online for you here before I pass it off.
Yeah, so this shape on the right-hand side there of the curve is really, it shows two peaks. One's in the morning, one's in the afternoon, and between 4 and 9 p.m. is really our critical time when most people are using everything they can in their home. And so, and this occurs on the coldest day of the year, which could be December, January timeframe, but we have a lot of electric heat in the province, and that's 100% efficient, electric resistance heat, but it comes on at the worst time, so to speak. But so we have to, our grid has to be built to meet that peak, and if it doesn't, then transformers blow up or something that we don't want to happen. So we keep things well within line, and the utility manages the connections that we allow by looking at the data. And so Ben was mentioning that CEC designs your home so that the electrical system has the utmost of caution and care taken to size it. On the electrical system side, if we did that, it would be the grid would be 3 times larger than it currently is. And so nobody wants more generation or 3 times generation and so on. So what we want to do is work within the constraints that we have. We have so much generation. And so if we can move energy from the peaks into the non-peak areas, that's a good thing, because then the peak is shrunk. That's called shaving, peak shaving, and then shifting. So we shift energy from one time period to another, and that flattens the curve, so it's less pronounced in valleys and peaks. I think that's enough said on that. So an example of that would be, you will get rewarded if you sign up for a voluntary time of use rate, and you're able to take some energy that you're using in the peak period, 4 to 9 p.m., and moving it into an off-peak period. That'll save you a nickel if the less you use in the peak periods, if you take this time of use, voluntary time of use rates. Conversely, if you use energy from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., you'll save a nickel from the average rates in the time periods in between those two that I just mentioned. So our rates are not changing. There's still 2 tiers and so on, but there's a benefit for moving out of the peak, 4 to 9, and into the off-peak, 11 to 7, and that helps us out, and you save money. So that's an example of how we're trying to influence customers to look at how they're using energy. So there's some things that we're offering peak rewards. In this case, the customer will get $50, excuse me, $50 a year for being able to have their power controlled. And so this is done remotely. We have a system that sends out signals, and into hundreds of homes, literally, or it could be thousands. This is an emerging program, really at a pilot size, but this is an option we could use to help manage that peak period.
I just wanted to note too, so on the screen, you can see all of the different sorts of connected devices that can be part of the Peak Savers program. I have the one in the middle connected to my electric resistance baseboards. So it means during, that coldest day of the year, again, Hydra might go and actually turn down the temperature on my thermostat 1 degree as I've signed up to be part of this Peak Savers program. So that $50 is per season. This is a totally new concept for us as a utility and offering. We weren't sure how it was going to be received by residents, but last year in one of our first offerings, we had over 8,000 customers sign up, and we had just begun to advertise some of these rebates too. So we're thinking that there's going to be tremendous more success with this in the future, especially as we have more and more of these connected devices in our homes.
So this is the question, does the utility manage the peak power, or does the homeowner manage the peak power, or is it a combination? And I think that's probably where we'll settle out. The utility could potentially send a signal to a smart panel that responds with a prearranged program. Anyways, it's an exciting time right now in the electrical industry. We're seeing we have lots of data. We've had smart meters in the field for 12 years. We're now looking at the next generation of smart meters that'll have to be replaced at 20 years out, or after 20 years of life. So similarly, at the home level, we have all sorts of things going on, which smart panels, from my perspective, and I'm hopeful many others, this is the apex where solar and battery storage or thermal storage can help the customer manage their energy use and benefit from that, because they're helping out the utility, and so the utility wants to. So this is kind of a circular thing that we'll be developing. And so the first step of that is we're giving out rebates for solar panels on the roof and battery storage. And so there's larger rebates with small businesses, as noted on the bottom there. But this is a new offer. As with anything new, it's got a few growing pains, but we are learning so much about this industry and how we can optimize the combination of generation, storage, and management within a building.
Gary, sorry to jump in. Just wanted to let you know that we're close to time to pass things along to George.
I think we've got 2 slides left, so.
Perfect.
You know what? We were going to play a little video here. Maybe we'll just, we'll cut the video. We were just going to say, Ben had been talking quite about some of these smart switching devices and how you can actually not have to, add the load from EV charging, for instance, into some of your calculations if you use them. So we actually have our first incentive for one of these devices. How about we put the link to the video in the chat at least, and then you guys can see that. Okay, sorry, Gary, I'll pass it off.
No, that's fine. I think we're probably, if you can move to the next slide, please. I think suffice to say that we're trying lots of things, and there is no single answer. It'll be a combination of many. And yeah, I think that's all we need to say at this point in time, and let George have a chance here.
Thank you very much, Gary. We should be able to save a little bit of time. I'm working hard to make sure we're not going to share similar information, avoid some redundancy here tonight. My name is George Thompson. I'm FortisBC's EV Infrastructure and Investment Manager, and I'm happy to be here to share FortisBC's involvement in BC's energy transformation. A few particular points around this conversation today are going to focus on how we contribute to energy resiliency as our part as a utility provider here in British Columbia. The similar points, I'm going to summarize them a lot more succinctly because it's very similar to what Gary and Robyn just shared around long-term resource planning. Cover off how it relates to our clean growth pathway to 2050. I love electric vehicles, so I had to make sure I could speak to a few slides about that concept and our own load shifting efforts that are underway. And then highlight for my colleague who wasn't able to be here today, some of the home building and renovation rebate programs that are available, and how dual fuel heating systems can also support both energy resiliency and a continued tackling of those important emission reduction targets in the Clean Energy Act. As FortisBC, we're predominantly a natural gas provider in British Columbia. We serve over 1 million customers, natural gas throughout the corridor in the central region of British Columbia over to the Lower Mainland and onto the island, and across the southern border all the way over to Alberta. But we also have significant support for the Southern Interior as an electric utility, supporting the ages-old West Kootenay Power Act customers based in the Kootenays and Okanagan and Boundary regions, where I'm very grateful to live, work, and play. And through these efforts, we recognize our involvement in the overall diverse energy landscape that we have here in BC today, and recognize that this diverse landscape is transforming. We're going to see significant, and we already are seeing, reductions in petroleum product use and growth, and some of these less carbon intense products like biofuels and growth in BC Hydro and FortisBC electricity use. And I also wanted to share how we're affecting gas itself to make it less carbon intense during this time. But first, just highlight how important it is that we have this diversity and that we strive to make it as decarbonized as possible. So flashing back to January of this year and the all too familiar polar vortex that we experienced, another record-breaking peak energy use day in January, as reported here by CBC. And it's becoming a bit of a trend. We've broken energy usage targets, the records. January 2024 broke the previous record in December of 2022, and the previous one held in December of 2021. And I'm highlighting here the landscape of energy use on those resilient days to really emphasize not that it's not to downplay the importance of electricity here, but to demonstrate that the natural gas infrastructure, the gas infrastructure specifically, is highly valuable on those particular days where peak usage is occurring, and that is why it's so important for us at FortisBC that we find ways to continue to decarbonize it. So reduced a few slides here because Robyn and Gary did such a great job of talking about long-term resource planning. But at FortisBC, it's certainly as important for us. We undertake 20-year long-term resource planning, both for our gas and electric utilities, looking at all of those potential sensitivity scenarios that could create that high scenario of use, as well as that low and that nominal rate that we might expect, how that nominal rate can be affected by the amount of effort and dollars, frankly, that we can put into our demand side management programs. That's that energy efficiency that Robyn was speaking to. The planning effort we normally undertake every 5 years. We're last submitted our plans in 2021 and 2022 respectively. We're undertaking the next planning in essentially coincidentally, both for our electric and gas resources, to be more strategic and more effective at this highly critical time when we know the energy landscape is changing. And we are also planning to do it more often. So normally we would do it every 5 years. We're looking at doing it potentially every 3 moving forward, so that we have a more readily available and clearly understood future ahead of us and more accurate 20-year forecast. That long-term resource planning effort couples nicely with the overall growth pathway that we have at FortisBC for realizing the 2050 targets that we have, both federally and provincially. And FortisBC has 4 pillars that we invest time and energy and resources to essentially succeeding at. We have, I'm going to talk a little bit in more detail, particularly about the first three here. I'm not going to touch so much on LNG in this conversation, but the demand side management efforts and a little bit of program detail and share renewable and low carbon gases, as well as our efforts in low and zero carbon transportation. And before I do that, I just wanted to highlight as well that we at FortisBC also, for our electric business, similar to BC Hydro, put out our call for power, our respect, request for expressions of interest in September. So as Hydro's request is coming to a close, we're in the process of receiving ours. I'm very excited to see what comes of that effort. I'm very thrilled to hear that it was such a successful response to BC Hydro's, and I'm hoping we're going to see similar. Our submission deadline is the end of this year, and we'll be reviewing submissions essentially throughout the first 3 months of 2025 and want to be in the process of selecting and awarding some of those expressions projects by the second quarter of 2025. Shifting gears here into that renewable and low carbon gas space. This year is the first year that FortisBC has actually made a renewable natural gas contribution basically a part of its rate structure. Effective this year, every single FortisBC customer contributes to a 1% blend of renewable gas into every essentially rate structure. And there are voluntary options to blend as much as 100% of the gas that a customer uses within a year as renewables. Renewables from a carbon intensity perspective are on par with the carbon intensity of electricity, of grid electricity in BC, and in some cases can actually be lower because of the effects, the net zero and net negative effects of repurposing carbon that would otherwise be emitted by natural means, biomass, etc. So that is a form factor that's available today and something that we'll continue to invest in, continue to seek out new supply sources for renewable gases and explore other alternatives such as hydrogen for how it can continue to reduce the carbon intensity of our natural gas supply. But I love electric vehicles. I have a passion for them. That's why I'm in this role that I'm in today. And I'm very excited to continue to help propel this particular aspect of our business. FortisBC does own and operate a fast charging network in that electric service territory that I shared on an earlier slide. That is part of the electric charging highway that we completed this year in partnership with BC Hydro and other network operators throughout the province. And so we've been able to connect all the communities within the region that we serve, as well as with the assistance of the Community Energy Association and our Accelerate Kootenays that really launched this back in the day, to be able to serve fast charging in each of the communities we serve along highway corridors to ensure that people aren't stranded driving those electric vehicles. But we also recognize that electric vehicle charging, for the most part, is, and one of the great benefits of driving an EV is the convenience of being able to charge at home. And so bringing this back to the original presentation and those comments about how we can make it feasible to charge at home is what I'm going to talk about in a little bit. And I'm scaling down Gary's slide here. I chose to leave this in because I think it's quite nice to illustrate why it matters so much to us that we have involvement in this space of residential EV charging. This is just an illustration showing hourly potential kilowatt hours demand by hour that could be experienced by your typical single family residential home that might be electrically heated. We see that morning spike that Gary referred to, and then in gray, an evening spike that's fairly nominal. It might be a little bit higher. This is probably that peak that's occurring between 4 and 9 p.m. that we might be concerned about. When we enter into EV charging, as people are coming home, generally using everything they can, like Gary suggested, left unassisted, unsupported, and unaware, installing an EV charger and coming home, plugging it in and charging immediately, depending on the size of that EV charger and the state of the battery, could effectively double that peak load left unmanaged. And it could be a significant impact to the actual services at the street, the distribution system, especially if a few people in that neighborhood are doing it at once. The opposite side to that is the opportunity that's presented by this low energy usage period at night. So really having an ability, a highly flexible load like EV charging to make aware and incentivize the decision making. So this is that adage of, should the utility control it, or should we make our customers, the residents of these homes, the EV drivers, aware of how to charge off peak hours, and then to reward them for doing so. And so we also have launched a program in our electric service territory called Power Hours. And this rewards program doesn't just apply to EV chargers, it also applies to thermostats, smart thermostat devices. And we have incentivized registration alone. So just being able to know that you have an EV charger is worth rewarding in our perspective, is worth having some data for. So $25 credit can be applied right there for just registering a smart thermostat and an electric vehicle charger with us, actually an electric vehicle in our case, because we work directly through the vehicle telematics. We are then educating our customers on how to program the EV to not charge during the hours of 4 p.m. and 9 p.m. So it's more or less a set and forget that you can then choose to opt out of if you wish to or need to charge during those hours. And each day that charging occurs outside of those hours at your residence, it's a 50-cent accumulating credit on your power bill. So the average EV might, 60 kilowatt hour battery with our today's rates might cost, let's say $6. Now it's $5.50. So we're just making it even cheaper to charge, and we're sharing that benefit of educating a customer to charge at times that we can support. We have power available and capacity available to do so. And the thermostats as well, I just want to comment, it's a little bit different. It's not each day that you turn your heat down, you get a reward. It will be signaled, similar to what was described by Robyn and her device. And we will notify ahead of time, ideally within a day or two, of a potential weather event or a potential peak, like those peak days that I was showing earlier on in the presentation, that one is potentially coming. And we'll ask essentially that you participate in that event. And if you participate in the majority of events at the end of a season, we're going to provide another bill credit, $25 by registering. So shift gears here into that all-important aspect of investing in energy efficiency, investing in appliances and systems that can potentially reduce the actual energy and capacity requirements of your home. But first, I just wanted to emphasize that we are supportive of the electric vehicle charging rebates as well. And these we partner on with BC Hydro and offer similar rebates on across the province to assist EV adoption and help realize those zero emission vehicle targets that we have in mind. And so $350 rebates are available for single family homes. It can be up to 50% of the cost of installing a charger, as well as $2,000 per charger in multi-unit residential spaces, owing to a more technical and on average, a more costly installation in those aspects. And we certainly promote a best practice for multi-unit residential buildings to undertake EV-ready planning and to consider EV-ready infrastructure as the most, at large, the most fair and economically viable, the way to ensure that you're not overspending in the end for deploying EV charging throughout a multi-unit residential building parking scenario. So that plan alone receives a $3,000 rebate, 75% of the cost of the plan. And then EV-ready infrastructure can be rebated as well for up to $600 per parking stall. So we've seen that this is one of our favorite slides to share, is just how much of home use. This doesn't include EV charging. We really need to get that added in there. But the house without EV charging is using the majority of its energy for space heating. And when you couple in water heating, we're talking about upwards of more than 75% of the energy use taking place in that space. So the reality is, if we can provide rebates in this space, both for new home construction to construct right from the get-go in sensible ways that help reduce energy use, but also for decisions to renovate. We have built programs now, deep energy retrofit programs, that try to encourage not just pursuing one individual efficiency step, but we provide bonus incentives for choosing more than one, whether it's space heating or water heating efficiency improvements, or building envelope insulation, draft proofing, windows and doors, that the more items you select, the greater the rebate payout can be in the end. I'm not going to, just for time's sake, I'm not going to provide too much detail here, but if you have more interest, I'm going to show you where to find that information on our website at the end. I'm going to focus in on home renovation rebate programs, and that they today are very much focused upon our single family home space with respect to and including all multiplexes, duplexes, triplexes, row homes, and townhomes, as well as permanently foundationed mobile homes. And the idea of any rebate that we provide with respect to energy efficiency is that we've been able to essentially demonstrate that the cost effectiveness of providing these dollars far surpasses, in terms of the economics, the cost of investing in additional infrastructure in order to meet the energy supply without these kinds of efficiency deployments. And where I wanted to focus some time, because we've talked a lot about heat pumps, is just to emphasize that dual fuel heating systems are also eligible for these rebates today and do support those emission reductions we were talking about with respect to Clean BC and the Clean Energy Act, provided that the air source heat pump is coupled with a high efficiency natural gas furnace as its backup during those cold weather days. So the majority of the year, all cooling periods, all shoulder season, and most really just those peak energy days, the air source heat pump would be running on electricity. And then for those peak periods, be taking advantage of the natural gas infrastructure that's available in your area. And maybe you're also voluntarily increasing yourself to 100% renewables as well on that. So there are rebates available for this. The rebates do expect and really emphasize that eligibility is only for replacing aged infrastructure here. So we're not wanting to rip and replace high quality deployments that are high efficiency already. The furnaces that need to be replaced in these cases need to be more than 10 years old in order to prevent wastefulness. These rebates can top out at $15,000 for these units. They aren't cheap. So having a sufficient rebate is really viable and important in this particular case. And then, like I mentioned before, we've added additional rebates for considering deployments of this kind of infrastructure in the north, particularly where we recognize air source heat pumps are maybe not as adopted, although that is certainly changing with technology advancements. And then further, we're providing additional incentives to contractors for and if they supply commissioning paperwork alongside their rebates to demonstrate that the equipment that's been installed is right-sized. This is the equipment that actually is required for the space. It's going to be using the electricity that it needs to, not more than it needs to, because it was convenient or on sale or whatever reason. So there's some added incentive to contractors to demonstrate that within their commissioning documents. And then I've got a mention here on thermostats, because thermostats are also incentivized here. If you wanted to participate in that Power Hours program I was referring to before, but you don't have a smart thermostat yet, you can get a rebate for that and then participate in the Power Hours rewards program. There are those bonus rebates. This is what emphasizes that choice of more than one item at a time. You can get, as in the more popular cases, choosing 2 at once gets you an additional $300 in rebates. And that is certainly selected often. There's deeper rebates available if you choose the approach where you pre and post utilize a program qualified energy advisor to validate and enter guide deployment of your infrastructure. And like I mentioned, there's a lot more detail on this at rebates.fortisbc.com, or our customer service team would be happy to assist you. You can call them Monday to Friday, 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. at 1-855-909-2329. And I really appreciate the time allotted to me. Jenna, I'll pass it back to you.
Perfect. Just in time. All right. Thanks, folks. So we're going to take the remaining 10 minutes here for questions for BC Hydro and FortisBC. All right. So I have been keeping track of the questions in the chat. We'll get through as many as we can in the next 10 minutes. So I'll just start off here with the first question. Lori just asked whether Site C was being used for LNG plants, liquefied natural gas plants.
exclusively, or certainly a portion of it will go to any electrical use across the province. So I guess the short answer to that would be yes. But I'm not sure if she meant, is the entire capacity of Site C going to be taken up by LNG, which is not the case, but.
Perfect. Thank you. Okay, perfect. Yes, she was wondering if the entire capacity was. So thanks for answering that question there, Robyn. And then she just asked if you could counter criticism that BC Hydro doesn't have enough power to handle EVs and electrification of buildings. I know you talked through some of your strategies in the presentation, but if you have anything more to add there.
Yeah, I guess I would add, like, one of the integral parts of our integrated resource plan is actually not just a load forecast, like looking at how much demand there will be, but is also looking at the amount of potential new electricity supply that's available within BC. And I think we're really hoping, even just that first call for power, it was an incredibly short timeline that applicants had to bid into that process. Like, they had to have their projects ready within 6 months. And within that time frame, we even got triple the amount of applications that we were hoping for. We've also made a commitment to actually engage in that integrated resource planning process instead of on a 5-year rolling cycle, an 18-month cycle, to ensure that we are planning to meet demand into the future. And so I guess, like, there's a number of various additional pieces of information that we didn't share we can go into, but really, I think it's a big challenge for us that there are a lot of voices out there saying that hydro isn't going to be able to meet this demand. But when I look at who's saying it and their credentials, sometimes it's challenging to see that they're not long-term energy planners too. So that'll be a challenge for us going forward, I guess, is just dealing with the credentials of those who are making some of the claims, I suppose, too. Also, the province is engaging in their own exercise under something called the Climate Aligned Energy Framework, where they're looking at what the demand for not just clean electricity, but all sources of renewable energy within the province will look like, and what system changes will need to be made as a result of that. So when that's done, we'll have another thing to point to, I think, outside of the analysis that we've done as utility alone. That'll be helpful as well, too.
I think
Yeah, great.
it's important.
Oh.
I think it's important to recognize that the renewables that we can deploy now can be implemented in a fraction of the time that Site C would come online. Will there be another Site C? Probably not. My lifetime, certainly. And it took a long time to do it. But now we're seeing fields that in Alberta, for instance, where they've deployed literally kilometers square of photovoltaics or put in windmills, and the lead time is a fraction of the amount of time. So that allows the plan to be more flexible and therefore more responsive. But we'll be going through, as George was saying, this planning and reviewing constantly based on the new information we're receiving, because we're trying stuff that we really, frankly, haven't tried before. Heat pumps are relatively new. If you do them right, they're golden. If you do them wrong, you've got problems. And we don't want problems as we build out electrification. So that's really where it comes in, being thoughtful in your electrical system design, as Ben was alluding to earlier.
Yeah, completely. And even, I think it was as short as 2 years ago, we were actually doing pilots and trials on those switching devices to now move into, like, full-scale deployment of an incentive program that, again, reduces the likelihood that a household could have this super high peak that brings down just that peak on this sort of micro level and contributes up to the macro level. Things are changing in our landscape so rapidly that with the invention of new technologies that I think are just going to help us meet this demand into the future too. So it's an exciting place to be too. And I think, George, I feel like you probably feel the same way.
I totally do. And I think there's, when we hear that a lot, there's this, I think it's comes from a place of this notion that investment is not going to continue to happen, that we're going to see electric vehicle adoption, heat pump adoption continue to rise and the utilities just stand still. Well, we're not standing still. If I had thought, I've been in the space over 10 years now, 10 years ago, I did not realize how exciting it would be to work for a utility. It is truly a very exciting time right now. And it's one that I'm very optimistic to see. And we have choice, we have options here in BC. And we have the benefit of that. We have a climate that can really support a lot of these different technologies. So I'm very much looking forward to that adoption rate to grow and to see how us as utilities continue to work together to meet that need for our customers in safe, reliable, cost-effective ways.
Perfect, thank you. And I know it's sorry, we just have a couple of minutes here, so I'm going to move on to the next few questions. But I know it's also hard to fit everything that's going on with Fortis and BC Hydro in a quick 20-minute presentation. So I do appreciate that. Ted was just curious, and I think this could be a question for both BC Hydro and FortisBC, if either utility forecasts estimates of year-by-year increases in electricity costs going forward. He just notes that it would be helpful to inform the business case for homes or businesses to purchase solar PV.
Saw that question was from you, Ted. Ted and I worked back at BC Gas way back. So anyways, Ted, I would suggest the only place that we could find that would be through utility commission filings. It's a tough thing to predict, and it's not that we don't, it's just that things are very fluid, and BC Hydro also has PowerX, which trades into the market on a minute-by-minute basis. And so there's lots of things that go into the cost of electricity, and the bottom line is, if we do things really well, energy prices stay low. If we do things inefficiently, then energy prices are higher than they need to be. And that really goes to Robyn's point about big investments for energy efficiency, because we know it works. And the technology is not emerging, it's here. So let's just use it appropriately.
Perfect, thank you. And a couple quick last questions. George, can you explain how purchasing RNG gets into an individual home?
Sure. Yeah. At high level. So when our customers today are all, they're involuntarily subscribing to a 1% blend. That's us providing 1% of the overall net delivery of natural gas in the form of renewables. So that is being funded. It's not that necessarily every home will be guaranteed to be utilizing 1%. It could be in one district over another higher percentage, but at a utility scale level, that amount of RNG is being used instead of conventional gas. When a customer chooses to voluntarily increase their support for a particular renewable blend, and there's different choices. I illustrated 100% because it's one, it's available, and two, it gets quite close to the price of electricity. So it is more costly, of course, but it's in effect supporting the transformation and continuing to emphasize the need for us to continue to find new supplies of renewables and grow that over time. So it's the more people that do subscribe and increase their voluntary supply, the cheaper it does become, just like gas has over time. But there's no guarantee that you yourself are getting that amount of gas in your home until we have 100% renewable for everyone.
Great, perfect, thank you. And we're a minute over time, but I'm going to squeeze in this last question here at a lot too. What is Fortis planning around solar PV? Will there be programs for Fortis customers that support residential installation, like the one BC Hydro is offering?
Yeah, it's really great question. Certainly of interest. I think having dialogue across utilities is really valuable. There's learnings that we would love to have and share. BC Hydro, we certainly have solar PV deployments occurring, and we have a net metering program today available in FortisBC's electric service territory. It's just without incentive from us as a utility at this point. And a solar PV incentive is one example of the many things we consider as we continue to undertake our current long-term resource planning. So that will likely result in some form of that program, whether it's a pilot initially or a full-scale market launch coming to market. And I think what really makes it viable is considerations around that battery storage component that we saw illustrated earlier. And where I get really excited is as the technology is adopted and shifts, battery storage can actually be the electric vehicle in your driveway. Getting the most out of that important investment and utilizing our transportation more effectively.
Perfect. Thank you so much. All right, well, folks, that brings us to the end of our session. Thanks so much, George, Gary, Robyn, and Ben. Those were great presentations. Thanks for summarizing everything so succinctly in such a short period of time. And thanks, folks on the call, for joining us this evening. We will be sharing out a copy of this presentation, sorry, the recording with the presentation slides with you within the next few days. All right, so take care. Thanks, everyone.